In 2012, 62-year-old Jose Malena was living in Los Angeles. He was the father of 6 children, and he had been working at Bumblebee Foods for the past 5 years. One of Jose's responsibilities at the plant was loading the massive industrial oven that was 54 inches wide by 36 feet long with these huge pallets of tuna in cans. The oven was designed to sterilize the actual can itself and process the tuna inside of them. At 4 a.m. on October 11th, Jose arrived at the Santa Fe Springs plant where he worked, and his supervisor immediately tasked him with loading a particular oven. So Jose left and got 12,000 pounds of tuna in cans, and he put them on this dolly and he wheeled it over to the oven. He walked over and opened up the oven door, and he looked inside and he saw there was a loose chain in the back. And so even though he knew he wasn't supposed to go inside of the oven for obvious reasons, he knew he could fix that chain in just a couple of minutes. And so he decided he would just go in there and get it done. A couple of hours later, a supervisor asked the other workers if they had seen Jose, and no one had. And so they searched the inside of the plant. He was nowhere to be seen. His workstation at that oven had been cleaned up. They called out to him on the intercom to come up to the office, but he didn't show up. They went outside and they found his car was still parked in the parking lot. When they went back inside, everybody was just stumped about where Jose could have gone. And so they searched the building one more time, and then finally one of the workers said, "The only place we haven't looked is inside the oven he was last seen loading." And so they turned off the oven, but they had to wait 30 minutes for it to cool down before it was safe to go inside. And when they finally opened up the door, they found Jose pressed up against the inside of the door trying to get out. He had been cooked alive. Earlier, when Jose had gone inside of the oven to fix that loose chain, he had left all 12,000 pounds of this tuna sitting on a pallet dolly right outside the entrance to this oven. And so another co-worker had been walking down the row of ovens, and the door to the oven swings out, and so it would have blocked his view to look inside of the oven. And this worker saw this huge pallet of tuna sitting right outside, ready to be pushed directly into the oven. And so he assumed Jose must have stepped away to go to the bathroom. And so thinking he was doing him a favor, he walked over and pushed the pallets right inside, shut and locked the door without ever seeing Jose. And Jose, who was at the back of the oven, was probably caught off guard by the pallets suddenly coming in, and they boxed him in. He could not have ran to the front to get out in time. And it was so loud inside of the plant that even if Jose had been yelling, "Hey, I'm in here," it's unlikely the other coworker would have heard him. Once Jose's coworker turned on the oven he was inside of, it would not have immediately heated up to lethal temperatures. In fact, it was a fairly gradual heating process up to 270 degrees over a 2-hour period. And the human body can survive at 200 degrees or higher for up to 10 minutes. But at 212 degrees, your blood will actually boil, and that would kill you. Which means Jose would have had the time to fully recognize the situation he was in. And unfortunately, there was no kill switch inside of the oven, and there was no emergency exit. And so Jose just forced himself along the edge of the oven, past all the pallets to the front door, and banged on it until he slowly cooked to death. The deputy district attorney that prosecuted Bumblebee Foods in the lawsuit that followed this case said this was the worst circumstances of death he had ever witnessed. Bumblebee Foods paid Jose's family $1.5 million. They also paid $3 million to upgrade all of their industrial ovens. Jacob Cockle always loved the water. He grew up in a town called Penzance in the UK, and he spent virtually all of his time surfing at one of their beaches. By the time he was 10 years old, he started skipping school to go surfing and started getting in a lot of trouble for that. But despite his parents' and his teachers' frustrations with him, there was always one person that had his back and totally understood him, and that was his older sister, Grace. They were so close, they developed their own special language they talked to each other in, and Jacob used it so much that people actually thought he had a speech problem. But when Jacob was 17, his life was turned upside down when Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and she died very quickly after that. This had a profound impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had totally changed overnight, and he began to believe that Grace's energy had been transferred to him, and that it was now his duty to live for the two of them. And so what this translated to is Jacob began taking lots and lots of risks because he felt like he didn't want to pass up opportunities. He wanted to live life to the fullest, even if it was a little bit reckless. In addition to loving the water, Jacob also loved photography. And so with this new risk-taking attitude, he began doing these water-based stunts and filming himself in the process. Things like surfing in storms, or leaping off of buildings into fairly shallow water, or diving to dangerous depths on a breath hold. And Jacob loved it. He loved taking these risks. He loved filming himself taking these risks. And so he decided this was going to be his career. He was going to be a world-famous photographer that specialized in dangerous photos and films. And so Jacob got this big piece of paper and he put it on his bedroom wall, and with black marker, he wrote himself a reminder: I will become a world famous photographer and I will let nothing stand in my way. Basically, he was prepared to go to any length to get the shots that he needed to get. And this intense attitude worked. By his early 20s, he had won major awards with National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He was also a regular contributor to surf magazines where he almost always got the cover shot. Most of his award-winning pictures were taken of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. Like the shot of a fishing boat coming back into port in a large swell won a competition that put it all over the London Underground. Or this shot he took, which is off the coast of Sumatra out in the middle of the ocean, as Jacob and his friend are right in front of the supertanker that's bearing down on both of them, and his friend is surfing off the wake caused by the supertanker. So a very dangerous picture to take, but it won an award that was run by The Guardian. The money Jacob earned from these competitions he spent on improving his photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize, like a brand new TV, he would just give it away to his friends, because all Jacob was really focused on was going out and living life to the fullest and taking crazy chances and capturing those experiences on film. And one crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film actually took place right in his hometown of Penzance. A very strong whirlpool would appear a few times a year in a harbor that was right near his childhood home. It was just a quirk of engineering designed to keep the harbor from silting up. At high tide, the water would come in and it would hit this quay wall, and at the bottom of the quay wall was a tunnel that fed into this other pool. And so that would fill up with water, and then when the tide retreated during low tide, the water in the harbor would drain out and the water from the pool would slowly filter out back through this tunnel, pushing the silt and sand out of the harbor. But sometimes when the water came into the harbor during high tide, it would come in so quickly it would build up against the quay wall and it wouldn't drain fast enough down through that tunnel into the pool. And so just like in your bathtub, if you pull the plug when it's full, you'll see a whirlpool form as the water is sucked down the drain. The same thing would happen at this quay wall as all this water is being forced down and sucked through this pipe. It would create this huge whirlpool that you could see on the surface from the quay wall. And even though this whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, it was so dangerous. There were caution signs all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall telling people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob ignored those signs and he started jumping into this whirlpool every time it formed. And he was able to kind of swirl around the outside and he would film it inside and just on top, and he would upload his videos to YouTube and they would get millions and millions of views. They were totally beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On May 28th, 2013, when Jacob was 28 years old, he noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown and he wanted to go out and film inside of it again. And so he ran to his friend David's house and he asked him to, hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool. And so by the time David got his stuff together and made it to the quay wall, he looked down and he saw Jacob was already in the whirlpool swirling around. David also noticed that Jacob was wearing a rubber horse head mask, and he told David the reason he was doing it is because it would be more eye-catching on YouTube. So David leaned over the wall and began filming Jacob as he swirled around this whirlpool in his horse mask making neighing sounds, and at some point Jacob stopped and he swam away from the whirlpool, but you could see the pull of the whirlpool was very strong because even with flippers on, Jacob really struggled to swim away from this whirlpool. But he was in good spirits about it and he was laughing with David and saying how when he first jumped in, he was actually pretty scared of this whirlpool. It's definitely the strongest one he had been in over at this quay wall. And David would say, yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, David and Jacob kind of joked back and forth about the strength of the whirlpool, and Jacob would put his mask back down and swirl around inside of the whirlpool, then get out again. And then towards the end of the video, Jacob yells up to David that he only has one more thing in mind that he wants to do with the whirlpool. He wants to dive down below and film it from underneath. And so he asks David to hand down his camera. David hands it down, and you see Jacob adjusting his camera, and then he dives below the surface to begin filming this whirlpool. And so David's up on the top watching Jacob, and he's very familiar with Jacob. He knows he does things like this. He knows he has a great breath hold. But after a couple of minutes, when he doesn't reemerge, David gets scared and starts yelling for him. And when he still doesn't come up, David turns and runs to the other side of the quay wall and looks over that railing towards the pool side, and he can see the water is still rushing into the pool, and there's no sign of Jacob. And so he ran back and forth forth a couple of times and he didn't see Jacob until finally he went back to the poolside and he saw Jacob down below. He was lying face down in the water. So David ran down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was able to swirl around at the top of this whirlpool and not get pulled under is because he had a wetsuit on, and wetsuits are buoyant. But as you go underneath the water, the deeper you go, the water pressure pushes against your wetsuit and it reduces the overall buoyancy of your wetsuit. And so when Jacob dove down into this whirlpool, the pressure pushed against his suit, he lost his buoyancy, and then he got caught up in the current of this very strong whirlpool, and he was pulled slowly down to the bottom. And so he probably fought as much as he could to try to get out of there, but he couldn't, and eventually was forced into that tunnel underneath the quay wall, and he was under there until he drowned, and then he was eventually spit out the other side. In July of 1988, 18-year-old Adriana and her husband, Jay Dickinson, were living in Anchorage, Alaska, just 1 month after getting married in Nevada. Jay, who had lived in Alaska for several years before Adriana joined him, had taken up an interest in something called placer mining, which is basically mining riverbeds for minerals like gold. And as soon as Adriana moved in, she picked up the hobby as well. The area they mined for gold was south of Anchorage in Cook Inlet. Jay owned a gold claim there. Over the years, Jay had found it to be very cumbersome just getting to Cook Inlet. Even though it was just south of Anchorage, the roads forced him to drive all the way around the inlet before being allowed in. However, he had discovered a shortcut. During low tide in the inlet, one of the two northern waterways that fed into the inlet, called the Turnagain Arm, would be completely dried up and it would turn into this huge open mudflat. And so Jay could leave Anchorage, go south, leave the highway at the Turnagain Arm, and drive directly over and across the mudflats and reach his gold claim in half the time. On the evening of July 14th, the young couple decided that the next day they wanted to go gold mining. And so Jay checked the tides of the inlet to see what the status would be for the next day, and he was pleasantly surprised to see that very early the next morning there would be a low tide. Perfect for them. And so the next day, the couple got up at sunrise, they hopped in their Jeep, and they started heading south. They left Anchorage, they hopped on the highway, and they went south all the way to the access point to Turnagain Arm, and they looked out in front of them, and sure enough, it's completely low tide and it's ready for them to drive over. As they turned off the highway and drove down the small access road that brought them to the actual mudflats, they passed by a series of signs telling them not to go on the mudflats. But Jay had done this dozens of times without any incident, and Deanna, she'd done it only a couple of times, but both times it had been no big deal, so neither of them paid any attention to the cautionary signs. Soon they were rolling across the mudflats on their way to Jay's gold claim, but on their way, their Jeep suddenly got stuck in the mud. And Deanna, she hopped out, she went to the back of the Jeep and began pressing as Jay pushed down on the accelerator. The Jeep eventually lurched forward and was free of the mud, but Deanna was actually now stuck in the mud because as she pushed, she drove both of her legs down deep into this mud. She tried to pull herself out, she couldn't do it, and so Jay hopped out of the Jeep, walked around the mud, and got to his wife and began pulling on her. He couldn't get her out, but he told her he had a good idea. He went back to his Jeep and he got his dredge that he was going to use to try to look for gold, and he pushed it down into the mud and began sucking up the mud around one of her legs. And he figured if he just created enough of an air pocket by sucking out enough mud, she could pull that leg out, and then he could do the same thing with the other leg. And although it was a slow process, it was working, and slowly but surely they managed to get one of her legs out of the mud right as the 38-degree water began coming in because tide was starting to come in. Neither of them were panicking because the dredge was clearly working, and if they could just get her other foot out, it wouldn't matter that the water was starting to come in. They would be able to get back to land, back to the highway before they got caught in the high tide. And so he put the dredge down next to her other leg and he began pulling the mud out, and it was working, but then the dredge broke and he couldn't fix it. And Deanna's starting to panic, Jay's starting to panic. He puts the dredge back in the Jeep, he gets a shovel, and he runs back to his wife and begins frantically trying to dig her out, but he can barely move the mud. It's like it's cement. And that's actually the reason why there's so many signs around these mudflats telling people to not go on them. Because there's a very small window of time between low tide and high tide where the ground goes from being solid and you can drive a car on it to being very soupy, and it's very easy to get stuck in it. But before the tide completely comes back in again, it re-hardens. And so if you're stuck in the mud and you don't get out again before it hardens again, you will remain stuck in the mud and 30 feet of water will come in on top of you. And so Deanna's trying to pull her leg out and she's panicking, and Jay is doing everything he can to try to get down there and get her foot out, but the ground's hardened at this point. Her leg is completely trapped inside of the mud and the water is starting to come in faster and faster and faster. Jay told her he had to run back to the highway to try to get some help. He couldn't take his Jeep. There was too much water that had come in. It's now up to their knees. And so their Jeep's worthless. And so Jay is running away from Adriana, who's screaming for help. She's trying to get her leg out. There's nothing he can do. And so he's running through the water. He gets up to the highway and he manages to flag down some motorists, and he pleads with them to please come out into the water and help me get my wife out. She's stuck in the mud. And they look out and she's flailing around and screaming, and the water is now up to her waist. And so two of these motorists actually run down into the water with Jay and risk their own lives to try to get Adriana out. Meanwhile, another motorist took off for a nearby cafe where he could alert authorities that someone is trapped and they need someone out there right now. Very quickly, the fire department and the state troopers arrived on scene, and they look out and they see the motorists and Jay trying to pull Adriana out, and the water has crept even higher up on her body. She's screaming, she's panicked, and Mike Opalka, who's one of these state troopers, he immediately ran over to the fire department and he got this big rubber tube and he charged into the water and ran out to Adriana and grabbed her and said, everything's going to be okay. We're going to get you out of here. And he gave her the tube and he says, you need to start breathing through this. The water's going to be over your head soon. And so Adriana, who's shaking because she's hypothermic and because she's terrified, she takes this tube and she's clutching it as the other rescue workers are running down with all their equipment to try to get her out. And then not that long after that, the tide had come in to the point where it was over her head, and all they could see of Adriana was this rubber tube she was keeping out of the water. But unfortunately, every attempt the rescue workers made failed, including getting a helicopter in and attaching a harness to Adriana and trying to pull her out that way. Nothing worked. The first responders and the motorists and everyone stayed with Diana, holding on to her and trying to pull her out. But at some point, the water was too cold and it was getting too deep, and they could not stay out there with her long enough. Michael Polka, the state trooper, was the last one out there with her, and he was struggling to keep his head over the water as he's still trying to pull her up. And at some point, he noticed the tube she had been breathing in popped up on the surface with both ends exposed, so it had come out of her mouth. And so he fumbled with it, but his hand was so cold from the water, he couldn't really grip it. He tried to reach down to give her the hose, but she was flailing and panicking, and she couldn't get the hose. She could not breathe through it, and at some point she went still. And Mike knew there was nothing he could do. She was gone, and so he let go of her, and being hypothermic himself, he barely was able to swim back to the shore and get out and go up onto the highway with the others. And there they sat for the next 6 hours as they waited for the tide to come all the way in and then go all the way out again and loosen up to the point where they could go out and retrieve Diana's body. Unfortunately, had authorities been alerted to Diana's situation a little bit earlier, they could have got a special water pump out to the mudflats, and it would have been able to get her out even if the mud was hardened. But by the time that pump arrived on scene, it was already too late. The water was well over Diana's head, and she had already let go of the tube. In 2017, Daniel Beckwith was a 27-year-old genius hacker and prolific Bitcoin day trader. He was living in his modest childhood home in Bethesda, Maryland, with a multi-million-dollar fortune to his name. And he was hiding something major in his basement that, when it was discovered by authorities, he would be convicted of one of the rarest criminal charges in the American legal justice system. But to understand this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Daniel was born in 1991 to his eccentric and brilliant parents, Linda and David. He would be their only child. David was a PhD and an accomplished opera singer that had trained under a famous French composer, and he had also performed at the White House. Linda was a Columbia Law School trained lawyer who at one time had been a government attorney, but she gave it up because she described it as a scummy profession, and she became a vocalist like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, he learned how to read, so it was clear he had unusually high intellect, which Linda guarded fiercely. She decided that public schools were not capable of teaching her son, and so she decided she would homeschool him. By the time Daniel was just 5 years old, he was consuming entire novels, and shortly after that, he was able to break down and reprogram his PlayStation. But despite his incredible intelligence, Daniel had a really lonely childhood. He was rarely allowed to go outside and play with other kids, and on the rare chance that he was, his parents always hovered around him the entire time. And few playmates, or adults for that matter, ever came inside of Daniel's house because Daniel's parents were big-time hoarders. You couldn't take 2 steps into that house before knocking into a big stack of papers or books or old food containers. In 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's Parkinson's disease, which left Linda, his mother, to take care of both of them. And in that time, Linda became obsessed with protecting their property. And so anytime anyone walked in front of their house, just near their property, she would run outside and yell at them until they ran away. But despite their eccentricities, it was clear to anybody that knew the Beckwith family that Linda and David just adored Daniel. They just could not give him any space. One neighbor recalled seeing the three Beckwiths out trick-or-treating one year, all wearing these same matching hamster outfits. And this was well into Daniel's teenage years. Daniel loved his parents, but it was in those later teenage years that he started to realize just how smothering they really were, and so he began looking for other places to connect with new people. And he found a new community on an online forum called 4chan. There, Daniel got to reinvent himself. He adopted this kind of tough guy, genius persona where he bragged about finishing most of high school by the time he was 15, and that nowadays he just blows stuff up in his backyard to test his chemistry know-how. But over the years of posting on this channel, Daniel would occasionally let his guard down, and he would talk about something that was really close to him, that pervaded his thoughts at all times, and would ultimately be his downfall, and that was his extreme fear of death. Daniel's isolation looked like it might come to an end in 2010 when he enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the Amtrak train station with all of his stuff for college. They said their goodbyes. Daniel hopped on the train and he waved to them as they disappeared, and he likened that experience to being set free. It was the first time he was going to be without his parents for any amount of time. But unfortunately, after only being at school for a couple of months, he had to go right back home again because his mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she had hid it from Daniel. In fact, she had hid it from everyone and not even seen a doctor. And so when Daniel got home, she was in really bad shape, and she passed away 2 weeks later. Including Daniel, only 3 people showed up for her funeral. And so Daniel, with his mismatched clothes and his pants that were too short, he gave his mother's eulogy, and in it, he just looked dazed, and he actually said, "I feel lost." And then shortly after Daniel went back to school, his father began declining rapidly from Parkinson's disease, and so Daniel had to put him into assisted living. And so living by himself at his apartment in college, Daniel was overcome with grief, and now more than ever, he was just terrified of death because now he had seen it up close with his mother, and he was watching his father wither away. And so he went back on 4chan and he began talking about taking a more defensive position against his own death. What that translated to is Daniel began researching what the most common killers were for people his age, and he discovered that car accidents were a big killer. And so he reinforced all the doors of his car with Kevlar plates, and anytime he drove it, he wore a Kevlar vest, which he believed protected him from blunt force trauma in the event of a crash. Knowing that cancer was a big killer, he went out and removed every mole on his body as a preventative measure. But what Daniel viewed as the biggest threat to his life was not something that statisticians would tell you is something people his age or people in his country should be worried about, and that was a nuclear attack on the United States. Daniel believed it was imminent. Daniel believed the only way he could protect himself was to build a proper fallout shelter, and because his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, he had the means to construct one. And so he left college and went back to his home. He went down into the basement and he picked a spot right in the middle of the ground and he began digging. Over the next 2 years, Daniel spent part of his time living at college, being a really good student, and the other half of his time was spent living at his family home, hiring different contractors to come in and dig out this massive labyrinth of tunnels underneath his property. But in 2012, his schoolwork and his tunnel work had to come to a complete stop because he got in trouble with the law. Professors at Daniel's school began reporting that somebody was sneaking into their office, hacking into their computer, and then sending these really inappropriate and embarrassing emails to everybody in their contact list, which was primarily former and current students and faculty. And then whoever it was that was hacking their computer was then supergluing their door shut. After several months of investigating, the police finally got a suspect when students on campus said, yeah, Daniel Beckwith is actually a prolific hacker, and he just spoke at a hacker conference, so he seems like someone who would be capable of doing this. And so a detective went to Daniel's apartment to pay him a casual visit, but Daniel wasn't there or didn't come to the door, and the detective looked down and saw a package that was sitting there that was addressed to S. Loomis Detweiler. The detective believed this could be an alias for Daniel Beckwith, and so he went back and they ran that name, and sure enough, it was connected to an online persona that had recently been bragging about breaking into their professors' offices and hacking into their emails. So the police used this information to attain a search warrant. They went back to Daniel's apartment. He wasn't there. They used the key they had been given for for the unit. They went inside and they're hit with just this ridiculous mess of an apartment. It looked exactly like Daniel's home growing up, with stacks of papers and books and wires and computer equipment and trash and old food containers. And there was just this dirty mattress sitting right in the middle of the apartment with no sheets on it. And in the back, on top of a mini fridge, was Daniel's laptop. It was open and it was unsecured, so they logged into it, cloned his hard drive, and left. And using the information that was contained on this hard drive, detectives were able to, without a doubt, connect Daniel to the vandalism and hacking that had been taking place at his college. Daniel was arrested and charged with a number of serious felonies, but shortly before his trial, Daniel struck a plea deal and then immediately took to Reddit to tell the world that he fully expected the state governor to pardon him because he had made a number of significant contributions to his campaign. But that pardon never came. However, Daniel's sentence was remarkably light. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the college and then was given 2 years of probation. Daniel was expelled from his school, and so he moved back into his childhood home where he lived alone full-time. Once home, Daniel focused his efforts on this bunker he was building in his basement, which by now was a fairly large series of tunnels that zigged and zagged in different directions well beyond his property lines. Once Daniel hired a couple good contractors to continue to expand this bunker, he turned his attention to a new activity, Bitcoin trading. And in relative short order, Daniel became extremely good at this and made millions of dollars. By 2015, Daniel was off probation. His bunker was almost completely built out, although he did have plans at some point to hire more people and continue to expand it. And in terms of Bitcoin day trading, he wasn't doing it as much because he had made so much money. Now he just spent his time sitting inside of his bunker, live streaming on this new website called Blab about his investment prowess. And every time Daniel live streamed, he was cautious to never reveal his identity. And so he used the username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter, and he wore a large fire protection hood over his face, and he used a voice changer. Within his small but avid following on Blab, there was one 19-year-old named Askia Kafra who completely idolized Daniel, even though he only knew him as 3-Alarm. Askia was from a middle-class home, and he was the son of immigrants from Trinidad. He also lived only 15 minutes away from Daniel, but he didn't know that because Daniel never gave up where he lived because he was so obsessed with protecting himself against a potential nuclear attack. He just told people he lived in some underground bunker in the middle of Virginia somewhere. Askia longed to be successful and rich, which is part of the reason he idolized Daniel so much. When he was 18 years old, he received a $100,000 settlement for a lead poisoning case, and he for a second got to live the life of someone rich and famous, and he blew it immediately on expensive dinners and rented Mercedes and BMW cars. And once the money was all gone, he was certain he could get it all back. And his big plan is he was going to build an app called Equity Shark, which is basically crowdfunding that allowed people to invest small amounts of money into new promising startups. And he believed this app was going to be the way he made not millions, but billions of dollars. But he didn't have any real money to fund this app. And so he and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs that have dropped out of college, something Askia had just done, and they were certain they were going to get this grant. But despite Askia's confidence, he was far from a sure bet for this money, because Askia still had many of the blind spots of someone still learning how to become an adult. And one of his biggest blind spots was how quick he was to trust people. And so it was shortly after Askia and his business partner had applied for this $100,000 grant that Askia came across Daniel on Blab, and he was so taken with him, and he's got all this money, and he's so successful. And that's when Daniel told his followers that he was open to new investments. And so Askia, who wanted to get closer to Daniel and figured he could use some additional money because even when they got this $100,000 grant, they would need more money to build the business, he decided he would ask Daniel if he and his business partner could pitch him on Equity Shark. And Daniel agreed. And so in June of 2016, Askia and his business partner went to this hookah bar that was about 20 minutes away from Askia's home. And there they sat, waiting for 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter to walk through the door. And they didn't know what he was going to look like because whenever they saw him on his live streams, he had that big fire protection hood on. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door, they immediately knew it was him because he had this comically bulky shirt on where it was obvious he had a bulletproof vest on. And so this guy with the bulletproof vest walks over, introduces himself as 3-Alarm, aka Daniel. And so by now, Askia and his business partner are very accustomed to 3-Alarm's eccentricities like his bulletproof vest. They just kind of overlook it and begin pitching him on Equity Shark. And they tell him that the success of the company, they believe, is hinged on this $100,000 grant that they explained they are certain to get. They meet all the parameters. They are exactly what they're looking for. And at the end of the conversation, Daniel was convinced that not only were they going to get this $100,000 grant, but that Equity Shark seemed like a great investment. And so after a number of follow-on meetings, Daniel ultimately committed $5,000 to Equity Shark, and he told Askia that they would have to pay him back with the funds from the $100,000 grant, or if for some reason that didn't come through, Askia and his business partner would have to find another way to pay back Daniel. Askia and his business partner were totally thrilled. They felt like that $100,000 grant is a done deal, so there's no risk to this investment by Daniel. And shortly after they secured the $5,000, the manager of the $100,000 grant program called Askia and said, hey, you guys have made it to the second round of applicants. We need you to fly out to San Francisco and pitch your company to us. And so they're totally excited. They tell Daniel that everything's progressing exactly as they planned, and they fly out to the West Coast, but they book their flight to LAX, not to the airport in San Francisco. So they land 400 miles south of where they needed to be. And so they're cussing themselves for being so stupid about this, and they realize they can't even rent a car. They're not old enough to rent a car. But they were old enough to rent a U-Haul. So they rent this huge U-Haul and they start bombing up the coast towards San Francisco to make this meeting in time, but they plugged the wrong address into their GPS and did not go to the right building. They went in the opposite direction. And so by the time they finally got all the way back to the meeting place in San Francisco, it was too late, and the manager that was waiting for them was clearly upset about it and said, just go home, we'll be in touch by phone. Back home, Askia was totally embarrassed when he told Daniel about their botched trip, and he was convinced that they were not going to get the grant now because of how badly they had screwed up the meeting. And so Askia began asking Daniel if he would give them more money, because maybe if they use that additional money to bolster the app and make it more appealing, they will have a better chance at getting that $100,000 grant. Daniel eventually said he would commit more money, but Askia picked up that he was really hesitant and just seemed not to be very interested in Equity Shark anymore. And so Askia, hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and wanting to make sure he was confident in this investment, he said, hey, let me do something for you. I heard on one of the channels online that you're looking to expand some of the tunnels inside of your bunker. Let me do that for you. Daniel, who was looking to expand his bunker, was eager to hire Askia, but he told him that if you're going to work for me, there's going to be heavy restrictions on how this goes, because it's a very secret location. I don't want this to leak out, where my bunker is, because as you know, there's going to be a nuclear attack on the United States any day, and my bunker is one of the only places that's going to be safe. Askia said that was totally fine. He would do whatever Daniel needed. So on January 28th, 2017, just after 2 a.m., Askia sat outside his house waiting for some car to come pick him up. And at some point, Daniel showed up in a minivan, and he walked up to Askia, he let him into the van, and then he put goggles that were blacked out on his head. And then Daniel drove around in loops up on the highway and back around neighborhoods, giving the impression to Askia that they were actually going somewhere far outside of Maryland, but really they were only going 15 minutes away to Daniel's actual house. And when they got to Daniel's house, Daniel made Askia keep the goggles on. Daniel got out and he led Askia by a string into the house, and once they got inside, Daniel had to carefully walk him around all the junk that was piled up all over the house. They made their way all the way to the back. They went down the stairs into the basement, where Daniel had intentionally created this unbelievable maze all over the basement floor with chicken wire and stacks of bikes and books and more junk. It was designed so anybody who was working inside of the tunnels, that even once they came out of the exit, wouldn't even know how to get out of the basement. And finally, after bringing Askia all the way through this maze, he stopped him right in front of this hole in the ground that was the entrance into the underground tunnels. And at that point, he told Askia to remove his goggles. Daniel told him to hop down and take a look. So Askia hopped down and he's looking around and he's seeing these massive tunnel systems pushing out in all directions, and all of it is extremely well lit. And he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And he's looking at Daniel like, how far does this go? And Daniel said, it's huge. It was at this point that Daniel handed down to Askia a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. And he explained to him that anytime you're in the tunnels, I'm going to have to cover over this hole because I can't even have you in the basement. It's too much of a security threat for me. And in fact, I'd prefer it if you worked multiple days in a row, because anytime you leave, we're going to have to do the whole blindfold thing. And so you should anticipate living in the tunnels for days at a stretch. But don't worry, there's there's a mattress down there, there's Wi-Fi, everything's well lit up, and there's a 5-gallon bucket if you need to go to the bathroom. And so Askia, who trusted Daniel, didn't love this setup, but in a weird way, he was just kind of excited to be a part of this guy's life, this guy who he believed was just this really amazing person. And so over the following winter and spring, Askia would make the blindfold commute all the way to Daniel's house 15 minutes away, and then he would spend multiple days down in the tunnel chiseling away into these different tunnels that Daniel wanted expanded. But as well as it was going working for Daniel, Askia was dealt some bad news at the end of the spring when it turned out Equity Shark was turned down for that $100,000 grant. Askia was surprised, he was crushed, and he now knew he would have to pay back that $5,000 that Daniel had invested in Equity Shark because he wasn't getting it from the $100,000 anymore. And so he asked Daniel if he could increase his hours in the tunnel to try to pay back that debt. Daniel agreed, and so on September 10th, Askia was back at Daniel's house, and he was down inside the tunnels in one of the lowest sections that required squeezing through a very narrow section that Askia had actually texted his friends about and said that section made him really claustrophobic, but he had to do it. He needed to pay back the debt. And so later that day at 4 p.m., when Askia was down in that lower section, the power in the tunnel suddenly went completely out. So it's pitch black. And so Daniel, who was upstairs, recognized it happened. And so he navigated through all the junk upstairs, came downstairs, navigated the maze all the way to the circuit breaker in the basement, and he flipped the switch. And the power went on, but Daniel heard a loud buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. And so worried that could be an electrical fire, he turned back off the circuit breaker, putting Askia back in total darkness down deep inside of this tunnel. And Daniel went back through this really epic maze in the basement, went up the stairs into the kitchen to investigate the buzzing sound, and as soon as he left the basement, he could smell smoke. And he turned around and looked down into the basement, and he could clearly see smoke was filling the basement. And so Daniel ran downstairs and he yelled out for Askia, and somewhere way down in the tunnels, he heard Askia yell out, "Hey dude, what's going on?" And Daniel's like, "Come on, you gotta get out of there." But he was totally overcome with smoke, and Daniel had to run back upstairs, ran outside, he caught his breath, and then he charged back into the house, down into the basement. But as soon as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he didn't see Askia, but he saw flames leaping out of the entrance into the tunnels. And he knew Askia was down there, and he's screaming for Askia to get out, but he didn't hear from him. And at some point, Daniel just had to turn around and leave because he was totally overcome with the heat and the smoke. A neighbor saw Daniel come running out. They saw the smoke coming out of his house, and so they called 911. And so while Daniel paced outside screaming for Askia, Askia is down in total darkness. There's smoke filling up the tunnels, and he began making his way across that very tight section. But once he got out of there, he had no idea where to go because this tunnel system was huge and all the power was out, so it's pitch black, and there's smoke inside of the tunnel. And so he desperately starts crawling all over the tunnel. He's hitting dead ends, and finally, miraculously, he makes it to the exit of the tunnels. Everything around him is on fire. He leaps out, but now he's in a basement that's covered in smoke, and every time he had been led to that point in the basement, he had been blindfolded. He didn't know how to navigate the maze, and so he's looking out and it's all smoky, and all he can see is there's one window on the far side that he might be able to get to. And so he starts leaping over the chicken wire and the bikes, and he sneaks past a furnace, and it's just flames and smoke all around him. And he gets to this little shimmer of light, which is the window, except he realizes there have been metal bars placed in front of it. There's no way to get through it. But in his desperation, he grabbed a rolly chair and he put it in front. He climbed on top and he managed to break the glass, but then he couldn't get through the bars. And eventually, after a number of agonizing minutes, he fell backwards and was consumed by the flames. After the fire was finally put out and Askia's body was finally found inside of the basement underneath that window, investigators didn't understand how Askia couldn't have gotten out of the basement, and Daniel tried to lie about it and say, oh, well, he might have been asleep, that's his bachelor pad down there. But eventually, as investigators were looking for the cause of the fire, they uncovered the entrance to this massive tunnel system. And that's when they realized Daniel had put Askia effectively into a death trap. When the fire started, Askia was at the bottom of this tunnel system, and so he had to navigate all the way back up to the top, killing all this precious time as the fire grows. And then he finally got into the basement, and there's flames everywhere, but he has no idea how to navigate the maze Daniel had made down there. And so he managed to get to the window because it was the only thing he could see, but of course Daniel had put bars in front of it, and so Askia had nowhere else to go, and he just died. The investigators would point out that where he died, he was only 2 steps away from almost certain safety. He just didn't know it. After an 8-month investigation, prosecutors charged Daniel with involuntary manslaughter as well as one of the rarest charges in the American justice system. It's called second-degree depraved heart murder, where Daniel's disregard for human life was so extreme it amounted to willful killing. And so he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. On December 20th, 2019, 14-year-old Harley Dilley was on his way to school. It was the last day before vacation, and he was furious with his parents. The night before, he had gotten into a huge fight with them, and as punishment, they had confiscated his phone. That afternoon, Harley did not come home. So his parents called the school to say, hey, have you seen our son? And they said, well, we know he was here today, but we don't know where he went after that. So the parents called some of Harley's friends, and none of his friends had seen him after school. His parents were worried, but they had seen this kind of behavior before. When Harley got really mad, he had a history of running away from the house and staying out overnight. He usually crashed with some friend and they would cover for him, or sometimes he would even sleep in abandoned buildings. And so that day, the police were not called. The next day, when Harley still didn't show up, the parents started to get a little bit more worried, and because their son didn't even have his phone, they had no way of getting in touch with him. And so they finally said, we gotta go to the police. And so the police launched a formal search for him, and right away, there was no leads. Nobody knew where he was. Weeks went by, and the family was putting up posters all over town, telling their son that you're not in trouble, please come home, and everybody in the community is out there looking for Harley, but there was just no sign of him. Finally, almost a month after he had gone missing, the police received a tip. The house across the street from Harley's house was a vacant home because the owners were actually renovating the property, so they weren't living there. But they had cameras set up on the outside, and one of their cameras, when they reviewed it, picked up Harley walking towards their property on the day he went missing. And so the police show up at this property, the owners show up, they give them the key, the police go inside, they're yelling for Harley, they check all the doors and all the windows and everything is locked, there's no sign of a break-in. They go upstairs and in one of the bedrooms, they see there's a jacket lying on the ground, and it would turn out to be Harley's. It was the same one he had on when he went missing. And next to the jacket on the ground is this weird metal plate. And so after seeing this, the police believe Harley must be up on the second floor somewhere. He must have been hiding out in this vacant house the whole time. They don't know how he got in, but clearly this is his stuff. And so they start yelling for him and walking around the second floor, and it's silence. There's no sign of Harley. And so they go back in the room where his jacket and this plate is, and they look up on the wall, and pretty high up, there's a hole in the wall. And it looks to be about the same size as this metal plate. And they realize this plate is actually a vent cover, and that is a vent. Suddenly, police believe this could be a lot more sinister, that perhaps someone had harmed Harley and then taken evidence and stuffed it into a vent inside of a vacant house. So one of the officers gets a stool, they put it in front of this vent, they climb on top and they reach in to feel around for more evidence, and as soon as they reach in, they touch something and they pull their hand back out and they say, there's a person in there. And it would turn out the person inside of there was Harley, and he was deceased. Although no one knows exactly what happened to Harley, the leading theory is he climbed onto the roof of this vacant home on the day he went missing, and he looked down the chimney. There was no cap on it, and from his perspective, it looked like he'd be able to fit all the way down to the bottom. But what he didn't know was this chimney was wider at the top, and then as it went down, it got narrower and narrower and narrower, and in fact, the most narrow section towards the lower half, he never could have got through. This was an impossible thing he was trying to do. But regardless, he went in feet first, and he began making his way down, and then about the halfway point, he started to get stuck. And he believed it was because of his big, bulky jacket. And as it happened, he was right in front of this hole in the wall, which was the vent, and so he managed to punch the metal plate off of the vent. He got his jacket off, and he forced it through this hole, thinking that would give him a little bit more room. And it did. He began to sink a little bit further, and then he decides to put both arms over his head to try to make himself as narrow as possible. And it works. He starts to move down, but at some point he gets completely stuck, and he's struggling to breathe because the chimney is tight in his chest, and he's got his arms over his head, and he's starting to panic, and he lets out a scream. But as soon as he does that, the air coming out of his lungs causes his chest to compress, and he sinks just a little bit lower into that tight section of the chimney. And as soon as he comes to a stop, he tries to breathe back in again, but his chest can no longer expand to its full size, so he can't get a full breath. And so over and over and over again, as he's screaming and yelling for help, he's compressing his chest and sinking farther and farther into this inescapable trap until he reaches a point where he cannot go any lower. and his chest is crushed by the chimney. He can barely catch his breath. His arms are stuck over his head and his feet are dangling off the ground, and that is how he would stay until he suffocated to death. In 2002, Sean Doyle was a 25-year-old bartender who worked at a restaurant in Lower Manhattan in New York City. His regulars described him as a little guy who was very cordial and very friendly. He lived not that far away from the restaurant in an apartment building with his sister Shannon and his dog Emmett. And just down the hall from him was his good friend, 47-year-old Michael Wright. Sean and Michael made an odd pair, not only because of their age difference, but because Michael was actually a huge guy, so the size differential was massive. But they were best buds and they hung out all the time. On December 13th of that year, Sean had just worked a double. He got back to the apartment building and he was ready to cut loose for the weekend. And as soon as he got onto his floor, he looked down the hall and he saw Michael and his girlfriend getting ready to go out for the night. And they flagged him down and said, "Hey, you should join us." And Sean said, "Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted." And so he ran in his apartment, he dropped his stuff, he changed, came back out, and they headed to the bars. That night, the trio had a great time bar hopping all over Lower Manhattan. And then sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, they decided that they'd had enough to drink and it was time to go home. Now, where they were was only a couple blocks away from their apartment building, so they decided they would just walk. And so they get out on the street and they start walking home, and at some point, Michael gets the impression that Sean is hitting on his girlfriend. It's unclear what gave him this impression, but apparently he really believed it, because as soon as he saw it, he launched an attack on Sean and started just beating him up in the middle of the street. Witnesses who lived in the apartments that were overlooking the street would later say they heard a scuffle outside and they looked out the window and they saw a big guy wailing on a little guy. Then, with the whole neighborhood watching, the big guy, Michael, picked up the little guy, Sean, and shoved him. And Sean flew backwards and he ran into this plastic chimney that was over this manhole. It was there to let steam escape and also to make sure nobody went in the manhole. But when Sean rammed into it, it toppled over, exposing the manhole, and Sean fell 18 feet to the bottom of it. As soon as he landed, witnesses would say they heard a blood-curdling scream. It would turn out the hole he had fallen into was filled with boiling water and scalding steam because of a nearby steam main leak. When police and paramedics arrived, they heard Sean screaming from the hole, and so they ran over and they get to the edge of the hole and they try to look down to get a look at Sean, but they're hit with the steam and it's so hot, so they had to back up. And finally the steam clears and they get a look at Sean, and he's just standing in the middle of this hole up to his waist in water. He's obviously in excruciating pain, and he's just reaching up for them, his back is arched, and he's pleading with them to get him out of this hole. They turned off the steam main and they tried to lower something down to him to try to pull him out, but his body was starting to shut down and he couldn't grab on. So they considered sending a person down to try to put a harness on him and try to get him out that way, but even with the steam main off, it was over 300 degrees inside of this hole, so no one could go down there. And so knowing they could not help him, police, paramedics, and other onlookers just had to walk around the outside of this hole with their hands on their heads, listening to Sean's desperate pleas for help. And finally, after 10 minutes of agony, it went quiet. It would take 4 more hours for that hole to cool off enough that they could send someone down to retrieve his body. Judy Melinek, the famous New York medical examiner who did Sean's autopsy, wrote in her book, Working Stiff, that Sean's death was the worst one she'd ever seen in her entire career. His fight with Michael and his fall into the hole did not contribute to his death. His actual cause of death was being steamed alive. But what makes this the worst death ever is that steam burns, no matter how severe, do not destroy nerve endings the way flames do, which means Sean would have felt everything. Michael was charged with second-degree murder. However, it's not listed online whether or not he was found guilty or what his sentence was. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch. He undid the 3 dogs. He opened up the hatch. And then using a remote controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the 2 lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside. And so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up these scavenger air recovery hatches. And it wasn't the sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower 2 dogs and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman completely independently had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it, and he unlocked the 3 dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all 3 dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit, and he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there, and you just checked, right? He's not in there? And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there, it's all good. And so the 2 of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around? And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier, when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame, because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone, even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found, and so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch, and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you got to figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is going to become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's going to happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive. On August 25th, 2010, a small twin-engine propeller plane sat on the tarmac at Kinshasa International Airport in the Congo. As the plane was being refueled, the co-pilots, 62-year-old Danny Philomot from Belgium and 39-year-old Chris Wilson from England, walked up the stairs and into the cockpit. As the pilots got settled in and began their internal systems checks, the flight attendant walked up the stairs. She said hello to the pilots, and then she began preparing the cabin for the passengers. The main cabin began boarding at 11 a.m., and by 11:30 a.m., all 18 passengers that were expected to board had taken their seats. So the flight attendant closed the doors, went into the cockpit, and told the pilots they were ready for takeoff. This was going to be a 1-hour-long routine domestic flight to Bandundu, which is a province that was just outside the border of Kinshasa to the east. This particular crew had made this flight dozens of times in the past without any issues. As the little plane made its way over to the runway, the flight attendant demonstrated what to do in case of various in-flight emergencies, and then by noon, the plane was airborne. 1 hour later, residents of a town located just southwest of Bandundu remembered looking up into the sky and seeing the small prop plane falling through the clouds in a near vertical nosedive. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the ground right in the middle of the neighborhood. Luckily, the crash did not kill anybody on the ground, but unfortunately, the pilots, the flight attendant, and 17 of the 18 passengers died on impact. And the one passenger that survived was very badly hurt and was left in a coma. An investigation was launched into what happened, and very quickly it was theorized that they must have run out of gas, because when they hit the ground, there was no explosion, there was no fire, but upon closer inspection, it would turn out the plane had plenty of fuel. The black box, which is a device that records the audio inside the cockpit, was recovered, but unfortunately it was inoperable, so it didn't give them any other clues as to what happened. Investigators were stumped. Did they strike a bird in the air? Did the engines suddenly fail? Was it operator error? They didn't know. A few days after the crash, the one surviving passenger miraculously came out of their coma and remembered in vivid detail what happened up in the skies right before they crashed. They said as the plane was making their final descent into Bandundu, the flight attendant was walking down the aisle reminding everyone to put away their big devices and put their seat in the upright position, and as she got about halfway down the aisle, she looked towards the back of the plane and she suddenly gasped and covered her mouth, turned around and walked very quickly back towards the front of the plane into the cockpit where she disappeared. The passengers that had seen her do this were immediately concerned that something was wrong with the plane, and so they stood up and looked towards the rear of the plane where she had been looking, and right away they knew what it was she was concerned about. There was a hissing crocodile making its way up the aisle. Someone must have smuggled it on. And as passengers realized what was happening, they all panicked and stampeded towards the front of the plane. This sudden shift in weight threw off the plane's center of gravity, causing a nosedive that the pilots could not recover from before they crashed. After hearing this story, the investigators remembered that a living crocodile had been found around the wreckage, but no one had thought much of it because in the Congo, lots of exotic animals are smuggled onto flights. Specifically, crocodiles are smuggled onto these planes with such regularity that passengers often can recognize the very specific crocodile smell somewhere in the cabin. And they'll tell the pilots, they'll come back, they'll find the crocodile and the owner of said crocodile, they'll kick them off before takeoff. But obviously this time, nobody smelled the crocodile. Just after midnight on April 4th, 2013, a man stepped out of his tent into the pitch black woods of central Maine. He was wearing a wool hat, he had a nice brand new Columbia jacket on, some Land's End jeans, and some high quality boots. He was carrying a backpack as well as another bag that contained a screwdriver along with some other tools. He adjusted his glasses and then looked up into the sky, and it was so dark he couldn't even see the moon, and he thought to himself, perfect. He turned and began quickly walking away from his tent into this forest where the trees were so dense that if you weren't careful, you could actually get stuck in between two trees. And scattered all over the ground were these huge slippery boulders covered in moss where one wrong step and you're breaking an ankle. But despite the rugged terrain and zero visibility, this man was able to easily navigate this area as if he had memorized every step. After an hour of silent hiking, he reached this huge pond called North Pond, and while staying hidden in the trees, he followed the shoreline until he reached the edge of the forest overlooking this clearing. And right in front of him were dozens of cabins overlooking this pond. This was Pine Tree Summer Camp. He waited in the tree line for a few minutes just listening to make sure nobody was out there, even though he knew their schedule and knew no one was there. After not hearing anything and feeling like the coast was clear, he stepped out of the woods and walked up to the top of the camp to the dining hall, and he made his way around to the back door. There, he pulled a screwdriver out of his bag and expertly popped open the lock and stepped inside. Once he was inside, he pulled out his tiny flashlight and he made his way over to the pantry where he began stuffing his bag full of candy, chips, and coffee. Once his bag was almost completely full, he walked over to the walk-in freezer, he went into his pocket and pulled out a key that he had stolen on a previous trip. He unlocked the lock, went inside, he grabbed some frozen hamburger patties and hot dogs, and then he left the freezer and locked it behind him. He did one more pass through the pantry and grabbed some more candy off the shelves and jammed them into his pockets, and then after feeling satisfied that he had all he could take, he decided it was time to leave. And so as he made his way to the door, he thought to himself, great, another successful raid complete. Or so he thought. A motion detector had recently been installed inside of the dining hall behind the ice machine. As soon as this man had pried open the back door, it had picked him up and remained silent, but sent an alarm to the nearby home of Sergeant Terry Hughes, who was a game warden that was investigating recent thefts in the area. Terry sped to the camp in under 4 minutes, and he parked parked his truck a ways away from the dining hall because he was worried he would scare off the perpetrator. So he parked his car and ran on foot, staying in the tree line until he got right behind the dining hall. He ran up to the back door and looked in the window, and he saw this tall, skinny man walking out of the walk-in freezer. And this guy did not look towards Terry. Instead, he turned and walked farther away from him over towards the pantry. This guy pulls a flashlight out, he shines it at one of the shelves, and he takes some things off the shelf and puts them in his pockets. And then after standing there for a minute, the man turns off his flashlight, faces Terry, and begins walking towards the back door. At this point, Terry backs off the window and goes behind a tree that's overlooking the back door. He gets his flashlight in one hand and he unholsters his pistol and he waits. Terry watched as this man barely opened the back door. He slinked out the crack and then he began walking into the woods. And at that point, Terry leapt out, shined the light in his face, drew his pistol, and told him to get on the ground. The man didn't resist. He immediately got on the ground, and Terry called the state police, who were there only a couple minutes later. They arrested this guy and put him on a chair, and then they began interviewing him. They asked him what his name was, and the man just remained silent. And so they searched him, but they couldn't find any form of identification, and so they asked him again, "What's your name?" And the guy again didn't say anything. So the officers decided to remove his handcuffs and give him a bottle of water and then see if he would talk. And sure enough, he did. His speech was slow and awkward and kind of abrupt, like he had not spoken in a really long time. He told them his name was Christopher Knight and that he had been born on December 7th, 1965. He said he didn't have an address, he didn't have a vehicle, and he had never filed a tax return. He told them he lived in a tent in the woods nearby. They asked him how long he had been doing that for, and he paused for a minute and then said, "When was the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster?" And the officers looked at each other and they were like, 1986. And he's like, "Yeah, that's when I went in the woods." And they were like, "That was 27 years ago." And Chris said, "Yeah." The officers asked him, well, 27 years is a long time. You got to be out there with some other people. Is your family out here? You got a girlfriend? You got, some sort of companion out there with you? And Chris said, "No, I live out there alone." And in fact, the last time I had a conversation with another person besides now was in 1990 when I happened to walk past another hiker and we both just said hi to each other. Besides that, for 27 years, it's just been me. And it would turn out Chris wasn't kidding, and he went to great lengths to ensure he stayed completely cut off from the rest of society. Despite winter temperatures dropping to negative 20 degrees, he refused to light a fire in fear of giving away his camp. And so instead, when it got that cold, he would just stay up all night pacing around his camp, trying to stay warm that way. He never even talked to himself or sang out loud because he was so worried someone might hear him, and he never left his campsite unless it was basically pitch black on an overcast night because he was afraid of being seen. When the officers asked him if he had access to the internet at least, he said, I haven't seen the internet. Chris wound up confessing to over 1,000 burglaries over the 27 years he had been out in the woods. He said he was ashamed of it, but originally when he had moved out into the woods, he had tried to hunt for his own food and forage for his own food, but he was terrible at it, so he had to resort to theft. He said he only robbed cabins and homes when he was certain no one was there, which meant sometimes going a long period of time between meals. And the food he did find made for a terrible diet. He mostly ate junk food and candy because it was stuff that was easy to find and kept fairly well. When asked why he had moved into the woods in the first place, he didn't really have an answer. Although in a later interview, he would say that growing up, human interaction had always been very difficult for him, and when he was in the woods, he just felt kind of content and at peace. When Chris's story broke, the residents around North Pond were shocked. For decades, they had swapped stories about someone or something haunting the area. Propane tanks, food, batteries, clothes, books would all go missing. They were starting to get scared, especially when it was overcast at night, because they knew that was when this person would come out. But despite staying up at night with their weapons out ready to confront whoever it was doing this, they never found him. And the police were repeatedly called to come in and try to solve this mystery, but they couldn't figure it out either. As the incidents mounted, the Phantom was given a name, the North Pond Hermit. When Chris was finally arrested and some of his life story was leaked to the media, residents of North Pond were torn on how to feel about him. Some people thought he was purely a criminal, that he was a thief, and that not only had he stolen their physical property, he had also stolen their peace of mind and their sanity. Others idolized him like he was some cult hero. He was a man that rejected what society says makes us happy: careers, relationships, material comforts. Yet he was happy. But regardless of how residents felt about his lifestyle, the one thing they could all agree on was how incredible it was that he survived for as long as he did. winters in Maine are notoriously brutal and cold. A week of winter camping would be considered a huge accomplishment, let alone an entire season. That was totally unheard of, and Chris did entire seasons 27 years in a row. Ultimately, Chris was sentenced to 7 months in prison. When he was released, he was given 3 years of probation, and part of the conditions for his release is that every week he would have to go physically check in with the judge, which meant he would not be able to just escape back into the woods again. When his probation did finally end, he did not go running back into the woods. He decided to remain in society. In an interview, Christopher was asked what he learned from these 27 years in total isolation. What have you learned about the human experience? What did you learn about yourself? Tell us, because you have knowledge that virtually none of us will ever have access to. And apparently he just paused, thought about it for a second, and then looked up at the interviewer and said, "Make sure you get enough sleep." And then he got up and walked away. While we don't know exactly what Chris is up to these days, people that know him say he lives by himself in a small apartment, he has a regular job, and he values his privacy over everything else. One of the least known, most hazardous jobs on the planet is saturation diving. These highly specialized divers do construction and demolition at depths up to 2,000 feet below the surface. Now, unless you're familiar with diving, that depth may not stand out to you, but it should. Deep sea divers breathe compressed air, which is usually a mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. During the dive, the oxygen is breathed in and completely used up and does not linger inside of their body. But the helium and nitrogen, they are absorbed as they're breathed in into the bloodstream, and they remain there for the duration of the dive. As the diver ascends in the water column, the pressure on them from the water is reduced, which allows these two gases to clear out of their bloodstream. But they clear at different rates. Helium is considered a fast gas, which means you absorb it quickly and get rid of it quickly, but nitrogen is a little bit slower, and so it takes longer for it to absorb into your body, and then takes longer for it to clear out of your body. If a diver doesn't respect this and just rockets to the surface, any of the nitrogen or helium that did not diffuse out of their bodies will bubble up inside of them like a shaken soda, and it will wreak havoc on them, and many times it can be fatal. This condition is known as decompression sickness, or the bends. The way divers mitigate getting the bends is they have decompression stops in their dive, which means after they go down to a certain depth, on the way up, they will stop at a certain depth and just wait, and they will allow these gases to diffuse out of their bodies before making their way up to the surface. These decompression stops are planned and built into the dive beforehand. The deeper you go, the more frequent your decompression stops will be and the longer they will take. To give you a sense of just how long these decompression stops can be, if you dive down to just 250 feet, it might only take you about 15 or 20 minutes to get down there, but the return trip will take almost 4 hours due to the number of decompression stops. If you're going down to 2,000 feet, it will take you over 33 hours to ascend. Naturally, this ridiculous time constraint poses a huge problem for any industry that relies on deep sea work, like oil and gas, because they simply don't have enough divers to compensate for how long these decompression stops take. They tried sending remote-controlled vehicles down to these depths to work on these offshore wells and rigs and pipelines, but they lack the touch and maneuverability to do the job. And so, in the 1960s, a crazy solution was implemented to get more people down to these depths for longer periods of time. And it was then that the commercial saturation diver was born. Instead of divers spending hours and hours making all those stops on the way to the surface, they constructed these underwater chambers that the divers would go into after their shift was done. They would sleep inside of these claustrophobia-inducing metal chambers, and then the next day they would put their dive gear back on, hop outside of the chamber, and then just start working again. Nowadays, these chambers are either left down at depth where the diver is located, and they can just go in and out, and that's the whole process, or there's a dive bell that sits down near the work site, and the diver, when they're done, goes back into the dive bell. It kind of looks like an escape pod, and it's raised by a crane all the way up to the surface, where it's placed on top of a ship or a rig. And inside of this dive bell, the pressure is artificially made to match the depth they've been working at. And then when they're placed up on the surface on the ship or the rig, the bell is connected to a bigger chamber that's also set to the same pressure they're at down at depth. And they can go inside this chamber, they can sleep, they can eat, go to the bathroom, and then the next day the process is reversed where they go back into the dive bell, it lowers them down to depth, they hop out, and they continue their work. The point of this system is to keep divers fully saturated with their inert gases like nitrogen and helium so that they only have to do one major decompression at the very end of their shift, which is oftentimes multiple weeks long. Now, while the saturation diving system has worked extremely well, it's still extremely hazardous, which is part of the reason why it pays really, really well. Some divers have died because they panicked and got hurt. And if you think about what their job really entails, they are going down thousands of feet all on their own into total pitch black nothingness. They have one crummy light that can barely see about 10 feet in front of them. They're operating heavy, dangerous equipment. There are large animals swimming around them that they can't see. Oftentimes they're perched on a pipeline, clinging to it, that if they were to fall off of it and detach from the dive bell, they would sink into an abyss and no one could get them again. And so it's an easy place to get hurt. Other divers have died because they were given the wrong mixture of gas. And so at depth, they began having seizures, and there's nothing anyone can do to help them. But the most well-known and brutal saturation diving accident involved something called explosive decompression. On November 5th, 1983, 4 saturation divers were working off of the Byford Dolphin oil rig in the North Sea. Just after 4 a.m., 2 of the men, Edwin Coward and Roy Lucas, were in their bunks lounging inside of that chamber that sat up on the rig. The other 2 men, Bjorn Bergensen and Troels Hellevik, had just finished their shift down below. They had gone into the dive bell and were being raised by crane to go up to the chamber on the rig. Once the dive bell was up on the rig, 2 dive tenders named William Crammond and Martin Saunders began clamping the bell onto the side of the chamber. Without getting too into the weeds about how it actually works, getting divers to go from one highly pressurized area, the dive bell, into another highly pressurized area, the chamber, and vice versa, basically, it just boils down to opening doors at very specific times, and doing it wrong will result in catastrophe. The process was going just fine. Hellevik and Bergensen had exited the dive bell, they'd gotten into the chamber, and they were literally in the process of shutting their internal door when outside, dive tender Crammond made a huge mistake. Before Hellevik had sealed his door, Crammond, for whatever reason, undid the latch that connected the dive bell to the chamber. And what this did is it created a vacuum that instantaneously depressurized the chamber where the 4 men were from 9 atmospheres down to 1, and it created so much pressure coming out of the chamber that it fired the dive bell straight out like a bullet, killing Crammond and severely injuring Saunders on the outside. Inside the chamber, all 4 men literally had the air ripped out of their chests. Hellevik, who was closest to the door, was literally sucked through the narrow crack because the door had not sealed. He was sucked through and rocketed out the other side. Basically, all 4 men exploded, but fortunately, they died instantly. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button you're going to take them on a vacation to Universal Studios, but instead just take them to the dentist for a root canal.